After Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and World War I, the country emerged as a respected but dissatisfied imperial power. National pride clashed with the frustration of not having been treated as an equal by Western powers. The Treaty of Versailles did not recognize Japan's territorial ambitions in Asia, nor did it accept its proposal for racial equality. That invisible wound began to ferment within the Army and Navy, whose young officers believed that Japan was destined to lead a new world order based on imperial purity. While the rest of the world spoke of democracy and liberalism, in Tokyo the conviction grew that those concepts were Western poisons meant to weaken the Japanese spirit. During the 1920s, Japan's civilian government tried to maintain a parliamentary facade. There were political parties and elections, but real power lay in the barracks. The military held a unique privilege. They could topple any cabinet simply by refusing to fill the position of Minister of the Army or Navy. Thus, they turned the civilian government into a hostage. Every attempt to reduce military spending or question expansionism was met with threats of mass resignations, media attacks, or covert actions. The economic crisis of 1929 struck Japan brutally. Impoverished farmers sold their daughters as servants in the cities, factories closed, rice became scarce. The military directly blamed politicians and financial elites. The word democracy began to be associated with weakness. In contrast, the army presented itself as the embodiment of sacrifice, duty, and national will. Propaganda portrayed soldiers as modern heirs of the samurai, guardians of a spiritual essence meant to purify the nation. In 1930, the London Naval Treaty limited the size of the Japanese Navy compared to that of the United States and Britain. For naval officers, this was an intolerable humiliation. Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura denounced that accepting the treaty was equivalent to accepting Western vassalage. Radical factions began to speak openly of Showa Ishin, the restoration of Emperor Showa, not in a spiritual sense, but as a total upheaval of the state toward direct military control. The 1930s became a succession of covert coups, political assassinations, and attacks. In 1932, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was shot dead by naval officers who accused him of betraying the country. Before the court, the assassins showed no remorse. The judge received thousands of letters from citizens pleading for leniency. Fanaticism was no longer hidden, it was celebrated. That same year, army officers in Manchuria staged the Mukden incident, a minor explosion on a railway line that they used as a pretext to invade the Chinese region without government authorization. Tokyo was held hostage by the fait accompli. The press celebrated the military as heroes, and millions of Japanese saw them as the saviors of the nation. In 1935, General Sadao Araki promoted the Kodoha Doctrine, which preached a return to a pure state, ruled by the emperor and sustained by military sacrifice. It rejected Western modernity and advocated a revolution from above that would eliminate corrupt politicians and selfish businessmen. The Imperial Army transformed into an armed sect. Every officer swore to die for the emperor, not as a symbolic figure, but as a living deity. Hirohito was seen as the embodiment of the national spirit, and his will was expressed through weapons. On February 26, 1936, hundreds of young officers marched on Tokyo and assassinated several government leaders. They demanded a national purge and the establishment of a wartime government. Although the coup failed, the message was brutally clear. Anyone opposing the military risked death. From then on, no civilian politician dared to openly challenge the army. General Hideki Tojo emerged as an implacable authority figure. His rigid face and metallic voice became symbols of the new Japan, a country where obedience was absolute and war was its inevitable destiny. Between 1936 and 1937, the economy was completely militarized. Factories began producing weapons on a massive scale. Children in schools recited oaths of loyalty to the emperor. Newspapers glorified death as the supreme act of patriotism. The entire Japanese society was transformed into a spiritual army willing to sacrifice everything for an eternal empire. In July 1937, a gunshot at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing unleashed chaos. The Japanese army demanded an investigation into the supposed disappearance of a soldier. Without waiting for a response, it launched a large-scale attack against Chinese positions. The civilian government tried to negotiate, but its voice no longer carried power. The war machine was in motion, driven by an ideology that did not consider peace an option. Japan was entering total war. The empire needs space, the invasion of China and the birth of barbarism. On September 18, 1931, a small explosion shook the railway line near Mukden in Manchuria. The damage was minimal, but it was enough for officers of the Kwantung Army to blame Chinese saboteurs and launch a full offensive without authorization from the government in Tokyo. It was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated operation, an excuse to legitimize imperial expansion. Within days, the Japanese army occupied Manchuria's main cities. Internal orders revealed the true objective, not only to conquer territory, but to transform Manchuria into the heart of the future Asian Empire under Japanese racial rule. In 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo was proclaimed, nominally headed by the last Chinese emperor Puyi, who was transferred under surveillance to Changchun. Although he wore the crown, he held no power. The true sovereign was the Kwantung Army, which ruled with an iron hand, enforcing military law, confiscating land, and forcibly displacing Chinese, Korean, and Mongolian peasants. Japan justified the occupation under the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a supposed alliance of Eastern peoples liberated from Western imperialism. In reality, the policy applied was one of total colonization. A caste system was established in which the Japanese stood at the racial apex and the Chinese were deemed inferior, fit only for forced labor. The first massacres occurred in villages that resisted occupation. Japanese troops executed the inhabitants and burned their homes as an example. Security zones began to be established around railway lines and oil fields. Anyone found outside these zones was considered a suspected spy and executed on the spot. Thousands of men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Imperial ideology claimed that the Chinese were an amorphous mass in need of direction. The war was not seen as conquest, but as purification. Manchuria became a testing ground for a new form of domination. Natural resources were exploited on a massive scale: coal, iron, and timber. Military factories and secret laboratories were established. It was there that Unit 731 was born, commanded by General Shiro Ishii, who was authorized to experiment on human beings under the pretext of perfecting the empire's biological defense. Prisoners were referred to as maruta, logs, a word symbolizing their dehumanized condition. They were infected with bubonic plague, exposed to chemical weapons, and vivisected without anesthesia. Everything was recorded as if they were mere laboratory data. In 1933, the Imperial Army began pacification campaigns in northern China. The orders were clear: crush any form of resistance with speed and brutality. Public executions became a spectacle. Japanese soldiers practiced beheadings with their swords as a form of spiritual training. The personal diaries of officers proudly recount beheading competitions between units. Military fanaticism grew, fueled by propaganda that portrayed war as a sacred mission to regenerate Asia. Meanwhile, Tokyo observed the military success in Manchuria and realized that the civilian government no longer held control. In 1935, General Hideki Tojo declared that Japan needed living space for its 70 million inhabitants. The idea was not only territorial but spiritual. The empire had a divine duty to expand or perish. National ideology maintained that the emperor was a direct descendant of the goddess Amaterasu, and that his mandate was to guide Asian peoples toward purification under the Japanese sword. In 1936, with the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany, Japan legitimized its expansionist mission internationally under the pretext of halting communism. In reality, communism was merely an excuse to justify total war against China, whom the military elite regarded as a people degraded by corruption and weakness. By 1937, Japan was ready. The Imperial Army had grown to more than 1 million soldiers. Factories were producing weapons at a frantic pace. Young people were taught in schools to glorify death and despise the Chinese enemy. The official discourse claimed that the war would be brief and that victory was guaranteed by the racial and spiritual purity of the Japanese soldier. On July 7th of that year, on the outskirts of Beijing, an artillery barrage near the Marco Polo Bridge triggered the conflict. Japan launched a large-scale invasion with a ferocity never before seen in Asia. The orders from the High Command were explicit: capture, destroy, and subdue. There would be no distinction between soldiers and civilians. The concept of total war became a tangible reality as Chinese cities began to fall one after another, and the first reports of atrocities shocked the world, though no one could stop the imperial war machine. The Nanking Massacre, hell on earth. On December 13, 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army entered Nanking, then the capital of the Republic of China. The city, devastated after weeks of bombings and combat, was practically defenseless. Chiang Kai-shek had ordered the withdrawal of regular troops, leaving behind only a minimal garrison and hundreds of thousands of trapped civilians. The population sought refuge in areas designated as safe by Western observers, but the Japanese army did not recognize any distinction between combatants and unarmed inhabitants. The fall of Nanking was not merely a military victory, it marked the beginning of a planned orgy of destruction. The orders from the Japanese High Command were ambiguous and dangerous. Troops were urged to eliminate every remaining enemy and restore order by any means necessary. In practice, this was interpreted as absolute license to kill. The soldiers, hardened by years of indoctrination that portrayed the Chinese as subhuman, began executing prisoners of war en masse. Chinese soldiers who had removed their uniforms to blend in with the civilian population were arrested, lined up along the Yangtze River, and machine-gunned without trial. On the slopes of Mufu Mountain, thousands of men were forced to dig their own graves before being buried alive or incinerated. The streets of Nanking turned into a human hunting ground. Japanese soldiers roamed the neighborhoods looking for any pretext to kill. Executions were public, carried out with rifles, bayonets, or swords. Internal competitions between units encouraged killing as a display of bravery. Military authorities did not intervene. Murder became part of the daily routine. In just the first 6 weeks, the population was reduced to a defenseless mass, subjected to a total vacuum of civil authority. Women were the most systematic targets of terror. Young, old, or children, none were safe. Rape became a weapon of war. Entire troops roamed the shelters searching for women. Many were kidnapped, taken to abandoned buildings, and repeatedly raped until they died. Those who survived were executed to eliminate evidence. Victims who sought protection in foreign buildings were dragged out by force. The notion of human dignity was abolished. The goal was absolute humiliation, a demonstration of racial superiority exercised through mass sexual violence. Simultaneously, systematic looting began. Houses were emptied, temples were burned, hospitals were attacked, and doctors killed for trying to protect civilians. Infrastructure was deliberately destroyed. The city was turned into smoldering ruins. The river began to fill with corpses piling up by the thousands. The stench permeated every street. Nanking ceased to be a city. It became an open grave. Attempts at civilian resistance were crushed with even greater violence. Men who tried to protect their families were executed on the spot. Any form of protest or pleading was met with mutilation and torture. Japanese units conducted improvised experiments. They tested grenades on living bodies, used prisoners to practice bayonet techniques and point-blank shootings. Victims were stripped of name and humanity. Killing became a mechanism of control and internal discipline among the soldiers themselves, who understood brutality as a demonstration of loyalty to the emperor. The exact number of deaths could never be determined with precision due to the magnitude of the disaster. Contemporary estimates indicate that between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians and prisoners were killed over a 6-week period. Tens of thousands of women were raped and mutilated. Entire families were exterminated. Whole neighborhoods vanished from the map. By the end of January 1938, the city had been stripped of life. Japanese forces began establishing military administrations to exploit resources and use the remaining population as forced labor. Nanking became a global symbol of horror. Yet for the Japanese High Command, it was not an exception but a necessary step in the construction of the empire. The brutality in Nanking did not halt the military advance. It consolidated it as a fundamental strategy of Japanese imperial domination in Asia, as new cities in China began to suffer the same fate. The Bushido Code and death as virtue. Bushido, the ancient code of the samurai warrior, had been born centuries earlier as a personal path of honor, self-control, and loyalty to one's feudal lord. It was a code based on moral discipline and the perfection of the spirit. However, in the 20th century, the Japanese Empire transformed this code into a doctrine of the state. Militarism reinterpreted each of its principles to forge a new kind of soldier, one for whom death was not a risk or a duty, but a form of consecration. Individual life ceased to have value. The only thing that mattered was the glorious mission of the empire and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Since the early 20th century, the Japanese government promoted an educational reform that infused schools with military values. Children learned to read with texts that exalted blind obedience. They recited daily oaths of loyalty to Emperor Hirohito, believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Shinto was declared the state religion, not as a spiritual practice, but as a system of emotional control. It was taught that Japanese territory was sacred, that every Japanese person was part of a mystical body connected to the emperor, and that dying for him was the noblest act a human being could perform. Traditional Bushido taught that the samurai must be prepared for death. The imperial state turned that preparation into a desire to die. Surrender was redefined as an act of absolute cowardice. Anyone who surrendered to the enemy dishonored not only himself, but also his ancestors and all of Japan. In 1932, the Ministry of Education published the manual Shinmin no Michi, or the Way of Subjects, which declared that the Japanese people possessed no individual rights, only eternal duties toward the imperial nation. The subject must consecrate his life to the emperor, the text proclaimed. The modern idea of citizenship disappeared. It was replaced by the notion of sacrifice. The spread of this ideology coincided with military expansion in Asia. Soldiers marching toward China were trained not only in combat but also in psychological indoctrination that repeated constantly that the enemy was inferior, that compassion weakened the spirit, and that cruelty was necessary to purify the warrior's soul. The military manuals established in 1937 explicitly prohibited surrender or the display of compassion. They stated that the Japanese soldier must fight until his body was destroyed. If surrounded with no possibility of victory, he was expected to take his own life or launch one final suicidal charge. Seppuku, once a ritual act reserved for samurai of high rank, became a duty for any soldier unable to continue fighting. As the army advanced through China, this ideology became a weapon of control. Officers were instructed to monitor not only the military conduct of their subordinates, but also their willingness to die. Courage was measured by contempt for life. Many soldiers learned to view death as a form of spiritual transformation. In the camps, ceremonies were held in which prayers were offered to the emperor. Readings were organized of texts that exalted historic battles where sacrifice had led to victory. The past and future fused into an absolute vision. Japan was destined to dominate Asia because its people were willing to die en masse rather than accept defeat. On the battlefield, the reinterpreted Bushido became a tactical element. Banzai charges, massive frontal assaults against enemy positions, were used to break Chinese morale. The number of casualties did not matter. The goal was to instill terror, to show that Japanese soldiers did not fear death. Units that fought to the last man were glorified in the press. The families of the dead received decorations as if their sons had ascended to a higher form of existence. The exaltation of individual sacrifice became a cornerstone of propaganda. The doctrine deepened even further when the Japanese began to face not only armies, but entire populations. Militarized Bushido taught that the domination of Asia was a sacred mission entrusted by the gods. The enemy was not only military, it was spiritual, cultural, and racial. To destroy it was to clear the way for the rebirth of a new imperial order. Every victory, every massacre was presented as a step toward the awakening of a greater Asia led by the rising sun. In 1938, as the war in China intensified, the Japanese state enacted laws imposing universal conscription. Every young Japanese male was required to serve the emperor with his body and spirit. Military training included not only combat techniques, but simulations of ritual death in which soldiers rehearsed the final moment of absolute surrender. The ceremonies held before battles reminded combatants that their lives did not belong to them. They were sacred instruments of the empire. Bushido ceased to be a tradition. It became a total ideological system that annulled individual will. It was the heart of the Japanese war machine, and it would soon become the ultimate strategy as the empire advanced toward the Pacific, where dying would cease to be a consequence of war and instead deliberately become its principal weapon. The prison camps and the contempt for human life. On April 9th, 1942, after months of desperate resistance on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the forces of the Imperial Japanese Army. Exhausted, starving, and sick, they expected to receive treatment stipulated by international conventions of war. Instead, they were forced to undertake a march of more than 100 kilometers under a scorching sun without water or food. Any soldier who stopped was executed instantly. Prisoners were beaten with rifle butts, stabbed with bayonets, or beheaded with swords. Some were buried alive along the roadside. This march, known as the Bataan Death March, became a symbol of Japan's absolute contempt for the lives of surrendered enemies. This contempt was not the result of chaos or isolated excesses. It was a direct consequence of the doctrine instilled by the Japanese military caste. According to the imperial reinterpretation of Bushido, surrender meant losing one's honor. A soldier who laid down his arms renounced his humanity. From that perspective, prisoners were no longer combatants but degraded beings unworthy of compassion or rights. The Japanese soldier, indoctrinated since school to despise weakness, saw the captured enemy as an object to be used until exhaustion and then discarded by death. The Bataan prisoners were crammed into makeshift camps with no medical care and insufficient food. Disease spread rapidly. Hunger became a deliberate weapon. Japanese guards mocked prisoners by offering them contaminated water or throwing rice mixed with worms. Slow death was part of the punishment. Those who tried to escape were tortured publicly. This pattern was replicated across all occupied territories. The prisoner was not a neutralized enemy, but a being whose morale and body had to be broken. In Burma and Siam, tens of thousands of Allied prisoners were sent to build the railway known as the Death Railway. Under jungles infested with malaria, forced to work more than 18 hours a day, they received less than a single ration of rice per day. Beatings were constant. Intestinal diseases, cholera, and dysentery decimated the prisoners, who were denied medical assistance. The Japanese considered that suffering purified the spirit, but that suffering was not imposed on their own people, only on defeated enemies, seen as disposable instruments of imperial destiny. In China, the prison camps were extensions of a system of brutal occupation. Captured Chinese soldiers were used as slave labor or executed en masse when they ceased to be useful. The killing of prisoners was done for practical reasons, to save food, to prevent possible rebellions, or to serve as spiritual exercises for Japanese soldiers who practiced beheading techniques as part of their training. Death was an element of internal discipline. Contempt for human life extended to the civilian population as well. In Manchuria, Korea, the Philippines, Indochina, and the Pacific Islands, millions of men and women were turned into forced laborers for the Japanese military machine. It is estimated that more than 10 million Asian civilians were subjected to forced labor under extreme conditions. Women, especially Korean and Chinese, were abducted and turned into sexual slaves for military brothels, known as comfort women. The Japanese army justified this system as necessary to maintain troop morale, but its implementation involved systematic rape, physical slavery, and the destruction of entire communities. In prisoner camps holding Australians, Dutch, British, and American captives, prisoners were used as human shields and as labor in mines, plantations, or munitions factories. Orders from Tokyo were clear. The priority was not to keep them alive, but to extract the maximum utility from them before their death. Suffering, hunger, disease, and violence were instruments of control and, at the same time, expressions of imperial fanaticism. By the mid-war period, brutal treatment of prisoners no longer responded only to ideology but also to strategic desperation. Japan, blockaded and lacking sufficient resources, saw prisoners of war as a crucial labor source. But even that usefulness was conditioned by the principle that they should never be treated with dignity. Death was not a logistical failure but a planned certainty. On every front, on every island, in every camp, the logic was the same. He who surrendered lost the right to exist. This principle, born from a code of honor manipulated by propaganda and turned into state dogma, prepared the ground for a new stage of horror. where science and medicine would be put at the service of the systematic destruction of the human body in specialized laboratories. The 731 Squadron, science turned into horror. In 1932, Medical General Shiro Ishii, a man of brilliant intellect and limitless ambition, presented the Japanese High Command with an idea that fascinated imperial strategists. Create a scientific unit capable of developing biological weapons that would guarantee Japan's supremacy in Asia. Ishii argued that modern war had to be waged with bacteria and viruses as much as with bullets and bombs. His vision combined science and fanaticism to destroy the enemy from within, weakening his body and environment without the Japanese army having to expend a single projectile. The plan was approved. Thus, Unit 731 was born. The main base was established in Pingfang near Harbin in occupied Manchuria. At first glance, the complex looked like a medical facility, a set of buildings surrounded by concrete walls and barbed wire. Inside, however, a structure of scientific extermination operated. Their experiments were designed and carried out on living prisoners, mainly Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, Russian, Filipino, and some captured Western Allied personnel. Prisoners were called maruta, logs. The name symbolized their condition as disposable objects, none left alive. The 731 Squadron operated with military discipline. Doctors, microbiologists, chemists and officers worked in specialized sections. Some studied infectious diseases, others focused on human resistance to cold, pressure or dehydration. In one of the wings, cages held thousands of rats and fleas infected with bubonic plague, cholera and anthrax. The laboratories produced bacteria on an industrial scale. It was estimated that they could generate more than 300 kilograms of pathogenic agents per week, enough to exterminate entire cities. The experiments were carried out with systematic methodology. Prisoners were deliberately infected with different strains of viruses or bacteria. They were denied treatment, and their deterioration was observed minute by minute. Others were exposed to freezing temperatures to study tissue frostbite. The doctors would immerse limbs in ice until the skin turned white and stiff, then thaw them with hot water to examine necrosis. Sometimes limbs were amputated and sewn onto other parts of the body to analyze the reaction of blood vessels. No procedure was performed under anesthesia. Ishii maintained that pain was an essential part of the experiment as it altered biological reactions. Vivisections were performed on conscious subjects. Doctors opened prisoners' abdomens to observe infected organs or opened their chests to study the function of the heart in agony. Pregnant women were injected with viruses to study their effect on the fetus. Newborns were dissected shortly after birth. In another section, grenades, flamethrowers and chemical weapons were tested directly on groups of tied prisoners. Pressure chambers and experimental ovens allowed observation of how the human body responded to extreme conditions of altitude or heat. Scientific precision turned torture into administrative routine. The 731 Squadron was not a marginal secret. It was part of the official war effort of the Empire. Its budget came from the Ministry of the Army, and its findings were shared with universities and military medical centers. Ishii was regarded as a hero within the system. His rank and power granted him total immunity. The reports sent to Tokyo were presented as advances for national biological defense. In reality, they were offensive projects. Beginning in 1939, field tests were conducted along the border between China and Mongolia. Japanese planes dropped ceramic bombs filled with fleas infected with bubonic plague over Chinese villages. Within days, uncontrollable epidemics spread, killing thousands of civilians. During the war, biological operations extended to more than 10 Chinese provinces. Along the banks of the Changde River, Japanese soldiers poisoned wells with cholera and typhus. The results were meticulously recorded: number of deaths, incubation period, rate of contagion. For the general staff, these data represented a form of scientific progress. Disease had become a weapon. In parallel, the 731 Squadron began training complementary units. Squadron 100, dedicated to veterinary experiments and transmission of diseases among animals, and Squadron 1644, focused on advanced bacteriological research. Together, these laboratories formed a network that turned Manchuria into the largest center of biological warfare in the world. Hundreds of young doctors were sent there to specialize, many convinced they were serving a patriotic cause. Scientific morality was replaced by military obedience. No one questioned, no one refused. In 1942, when the war in the Pacific began to turn unfavorable, the experiments intensified. Ishii ordered new bacteriological bombs to be tested, designed to be dropped from high altitudes without destroying the pathogens. Dispersal mechanisms were developed to release infected insects over densely populated areas. The goal was to create panic, overwhelm hospitals, and destroy civilian resistance. The exact number of victims was never known, but it is estimated that more than 400,000 Chinese civilians died from diseases directly caused by the operations of the 731 Squadron. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced toward Manchuria, Ishii received orders to evacuate and eliminate all evidence. The prisoners were executed one by one, the laboratories were set on fire, the main documents destroyed, and the buildings demolished with explosives. The cages of infected animals were emptied into the open air, spreading new diseases across the region. Ishii gathered his staff and ordered them to swear eternal silence about the activities carried out. Then he disappeared amid the chaos of the imperial collapse. The expanding empire, the dream of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The Pingfang complex was reduced to ruins, covered by the smoke of fires and unidentifiable bodies. In the following days, Japanese soldiers fled south, carrying sealed boxes containing the last records of human experiments. The empire's science had reached its peak of dehumanization, and as Japanese troops abandoned Manchuria, the war continued to advance toward its final expansion across the entire Asian continent. On December 7, 1941, while Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, other imperial forces simultaneously deployed over Hong Kong, the Philippines, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Guam. The offensive was not an improvised reaction, but the deliberate beginning of constructing a world order led by Japan. Tokyo presented it as a historic mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism and restore its dignity. The official name of the project was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In propaganda, the rising sun was shown illuminating a continent united under the benevolent leadership of Emperor Hirohito. In reality, that sphere became a network of brutal occupation. In the Philippines, the Imperial Army advanced rapidly. The cities of Manila, Davao, and Cebu fell one after another. Japanese propaganda proclaimed the end of American domination and promised the country's independence. However, Filipinos were subjected to forced labor, and rice and other food supplies were confiscated to feed the Japanese army. The civilian population began to starve. Thousands of peasants were executed for refusing to surrender their harvests. The discourse of liberation faded in the trenches and labor camps. In British Malaya, the Japanese advance was accompanied by a campaign of terror. The Imperial Army implemented the doctrine of selective extermination. Anyone who could be considered hostile to Japanese rule was executed by firing squad. The fall of Singapore, Britain's stronghold in Asia, was presented as the spiritual triumph of Asia over Europe. More than 80,000 Allied soldiers were taken prisoner. The city was renamed Shonan II, or Light of the South, symbol of the new order. Japanese authorities seized banks, industries, and rubber plantations. Economic control was absolute. The promise of prosperity turned into exploitation. In the Dutch East Indies, whose subsoil was rich in oil, the Imperial Army moved with strategic precision. Japan needed fuel to sustain its expansion and saw these islands as the energy heart of the new empire. The occupation was immediate, accompanied by the confiscation of refineries and wells. The local population was forced to work for the army. Dutch colonial structures were replaced by Japanese administrators who imposed martial law. Local languages were banned. Schools were reoriented to teach obedience to the emperor. Burma was occupied under the pretext of being liberated from British rule. A puppet government was established, led by Burmese nationalist leaders, but real power remained in the hands of the Imperial Army. Rural populations were forced to build roads and fortifications. The death railway began to take shape, using prisoners of war and Burmese civilians. Villagers who refused to work were executed. Harvests were confiscated to feed Japanese troops. The population began to die of mass starvation. In French Indochina, Japan nominally maintained the Vichy colonial government but controlled every strategic aspect. Bases were established to launch attacks across Southeast Asia. Vietnamese rice was systematically requisitioned, causing famines that killed more than 1 million people. Farms were forced to produce for the army. Repression was immediate. Any act of resistance was crushed with executions and the burning of entire villages. As the empire expanded, Japanese propaganda continued to insist on the idea of a united Asian community. Ceremonies were held where local leaders swore loyalty to the emperor. But daily life revealed the empire's true nature: forced labor, sexual slavery, the confiscation of natural resources, and the execution of dissidents. Military brothels were created in every occupied territory, supplied with Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Indonesian women kidnapped by the army. These women were called comfort women, though their existence represented one of the largest sexual slavery networks in modern history. The Japanese Empire reached its maximum expansion by mid-1942. From the steppes of Manchuria to the tropical forests of New Guinea, thousands of kilometers were under Japanese control. Flags bearing the rising sun flew over ports, airfields, colonial palaces, and remote villages. The map seemed to confirm the imperial vision, an invincible Japan leading Asia into a new era. But that sphere was not one of co-prosperity. It was one of subjugation. Cities under occupation suffered deliberate famines. Natural resources were shipped to Japan to feed its war machine. The people who had been promised freedom found themselves under a domination even more relentless than the European one. Even so, Tokyo celebrated each conquest as proof of its manifest destiny. In the imperial headquarters, they spoke of the dawn of a new Asian civilization, while across the continent's fields and jungles, pockets of resistance began to emerge, fueled by desperation and the accumulated hatred toward the invader. Pearl Harbor, the blow that awoke the giant. In the early morning of November 26, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers secretly set sail from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands toward the center of the Pacific. On board were more than 400 warplanes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers specially modified to strike in shallow waters. The fleet advanced in complete radio silence, shrouded in fog and cold, following a carefully plotted route to avoid detection by American aircraft or submarines. It was the most powerful naval air force Japan had ever assembled. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the operation, had warned that the United States was an industrially invincible enemy in the long term. For that reason, his plan did not aim for a prolonged war, but rather for a devastating blow that would paralyze the U.S. Navy and force Washington to negotiate. Pearl Harbor, the main base of the Pacific Fleet, was the target. If the aircraft carriers, battleships, and fuel depots could be destroyed in a lightning attack, the path would be clear for Japan to consolidate its empire in Asia before the United States could react. The morning of December 7th at 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese wave emerged from the clouds over Oahu. The pilots, trained for months, descended in tight formation. At Pearl Harbor, the battleships were lined up in a row like motionless targets. The initial explosion of the torpedo that struck the USS Oklahoma was the signal. Minutes later, the USS Arizona exploded when its magazine detonated, sending a column of fire over 180 meters high. In less than 15 minutes, the attack had paralyzed American anti-aircraft defenses. Dive bombers attacked the airfields of Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island. American aircraft were set on fire on the ground before the pilots could even board them. Japanese fighters strafed soldiers and ground personnel as they ran across the runways, the sky filled with black smoke. The torpedo bombers continued their successive attacks against the anchored fleet. In less than an hour, the battleships USS West Virginia, California, and Nevada had been sunk or severely damaged. Thousands of sailors died trapped in flooded compartments. At 8:54, the second wave arrived. Japanese pilots focused on the shipyards and docks. Explosions shook the harbor every few seconds. Civilians in Honolulu hid in shelters as they heard the roars of engines and the detonations of 800-kilogram bombs. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When the Japanese planes withdrew, 18 ships had been sunk or destroyed, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, and the Pacific Fleet's power had apparently been annihilated. In Tokyo, news of the success arrived that same night. The High Command congratulated each other. Imperial radio announced that Japan had dealt a decisive blow to the enemy and that the spirit of the Emperor had guided the pilots to victory. Crowds filled the streets. It was celebrated as the beginning of what the government presented as Asia's final liberation. The co-prosperity sphere seemed unstoppable. However, the attack had failed in two crucial points. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that day. They were on missions at sea, nor were the fuel depots or the naval repair docks destroyed. The infrastructure that would allow the fleet's recovery remained intact. The tactical blow had been successful, the strategic one had been incomplete. While Japan celebrated, in Washington, the shock turned into determination. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared before Congress that December 7th would be remembered as a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The regional conflict in Asia became a world war. Japan had achieved what its general staff feared most, uniting all American industry and people under one military goal. In Tokyo's imperial headquarters, the news was received with euphoria. Newspapers proclaimed that the Anglo-American lion had been defeated with a single strike. Troops celebrated with cries of "Banzai." The empire believed it had secured its destiny. No one suspected that on that day, instead of sealing its victory, it had marked the beginning of its destruction. Fanaticism on the battlefield, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At the beginning of 1945, the Japanese Empire had lost military initiative. The Imperial Navy had been practically destroyed, and air supremacy belonged to the United States. But the Japanese High Command did not consider surrender. Instead of preparing negotiations, it decided to transform each island in the Pacific into a fortress where soldiers and civilians were to fight to their last breath. Military defeat would become a spiritual victory. The goal was no longer to stop the enemy, but to demonstrate that the Japanese people were willing to die en masse rather than accept humiliation. On February 19th, US Marines landed on Iwo Jima, a volcanic island barely 21 square kilometers in size, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Anticipating the US naval bombardment, Kuribayashi had transformed the island into an underground labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and hidden chambers. The order was absolute. There would be no immediate suicidal counterattacks. Soldiers had to remain hidden and kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Surrender was forbidden. The official motto was "One death, 1,000 enemies." During the following days, the Americans faced an invisible enemy. Each cave was a point of ambush. Each hill concealed a network of interconnected tunnels. The Japanese emerged from the ground to attack with grenades and bayonets, then vanished underground. The fighting was hand-to-hand, without truce or negotiation. The Japanese, entrenched in secret positions, waited until the Americans were close to open fire at point-blank range. When surrounded, they detonated explosives to take as many enemies with them as possible. After 36 days of fighting, more than 6,800 Americans had died. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in combat or committed suicide. Iwo Jima was not a battle for a strategic position. It was an exhibition of military fanaticism designed to instill terror. For the Japanese, the sacrifice had been a spiritual victory. For the United States, it was a warning that every island on the road to Tokyo would be a greater hell than the one before. The Battle of Okinawa began in April 1945, the bloodiest of the Pacific Front and the last line of defense before the Japanese archipelago. Okinawa was not a military base. It was a territory inhabited by Japanese civilians forced to become soldiers of the last resistance. The Imperial Army distributed bamboo spears among the elderly, women, and teenagers. Student units were formed who swore to fight to the death. Propaganda repeated that the Americans took no prisoners and that they raped and tortured without mercy. The goal was to induce panic and turn the entire population into combatants. The island was fortified with a layered defensive system. Japanese troops entrenched themselves in natural caves and tunnels. Unlike previous battles, the enemy was not only in military positions but among the population. Women were trained to carry grenades hidden in their clothing and throw themselves onto American soldiers. 14-year-old boys were sent to attack tanks with improvised explosive charges. Civilians who tried to surrender were executed by Japanese soldiers themselves. Surrender was considered treason. During the 82 days of fighting, the island became an extermination field. US bombings razed entire towns. Japanese troops resisted to the last bunker. On the hills of Shuri and Kunishi, thousands of soldiers launched suicidal charges during the night. When they no longer had ammunition, they attacked with bayonets or used their own bodies as explosive shields. Death was the tactic, suffering the strategy. As the front collapsed, the civilian population began to flee toward the coastal cliffs. Convinced by propaganda that the Americans would mutilate or burn them alive, entire families threw themselves into the void holding hands. Japanese mothers killed their own children to avoid their capture. The beaches lay covered with bodies. Caves were full of civilians who died suffocated, surrounded by smoke and fire. The Japanese army did not permit evacuation. The sacrifice of the population was considered part of the national duty. By the end of the battle, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers had died. Between 100,000 and 150,000 civilians perished, nearly one-third of the island's total population. Japanese resistance did not stop the American advance, but it left a clear message. If Okinawa had cost so much, the invasion of Japan's main island would be an unimaginably bloody affair. In Tokyo's bunkers, military leaders began to plan the mobilization of the entire Japanese population, including children from age 12, for a final war of mutual extermination. Kamikazes, sacrifice turned into a weapon. On October 25, 1944, in the late Gulf, a sky covered with smoke and shrapnel witnessed something unprecedented in modern military history. A group of Japanese planes appeared over the US fleet. They were not seeking to attack and flee. One of them, the Rising Sun insignia still visible on its wings, began a direct descent toward the escort carrier USS St. Lo. It did not fire. It did not maneuver to escape. It simply threw itself onto the deck with full control of its trajectory. The impact caused an explosion that set off a chain reaction in the fuel tanks and stored bombs. Minutes later, the carrier was sinking. That was not a conventional attack. It was the official birth of a new weapon. The human turned into a projectile. That pilot belonged to the Tokotai, the special attack units. His mission was not to return or to fail. His mission was to die. From that moment on, sacrifice became official doctrine of the Japanese Empire. It was no longer about desperate fights, but about a carefully organized strategy to use the lives of the young as a tactical, psychological, and spiritual weapon. After the defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Japanese command realized that its industry could not compete with American production. Aircraft carriers, planes, and experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a solution: to create volunteer suicide units that would use the human body as the perfect guide to turn an explosive-laden plane into a living missile. It was not an improvised idea, but the logical consequence of the reinterpreted Bushido and the cult of the emperor. Japan no longer had steel, oil, or time. The only thing it still had in abundance was human life willing to be sacrificed. The imperial government did not present the idea as a last military resort, but as an honorable opportunity to achieve eternal glory. Farewell ceremonies became sacred rituals. Pilots walked through corridors covered with rising sun flags, while comrades and superiors sang national hymns. They received a white headband tied around their foreheads, symbolizing the divine spirit of the warrior. They were given a cup of sake, a ceremonial sword, and a portrait of the emperor. Each one wrote a final letter to his family, not to say goodbye with sadness, but to declare that his death would ensure Japan's rebirth. Although the official discourse spoke of volunteers, social pressure was absolute. Schools became selection centers. Nationalist teachers pointed to the most outstanding students as ideal candidates for the supreme honor. Refusing the mission was equivalent to denying the emperor, the nation, and one's ancestors. Many pilots were barely 17 or 18 years old. Some cried in secret while writing their letters, but when they stepped out into the courtyard, they lined up in silence, convinced that their death was not the end of their life, but the fulfillment of their duty. Training was brief. They were no longer taught to return or to survive. Only the final moment existed. They practiced the impact trajectory over and over again. Pilots were taught to keep the plane skimming over the sea to avoid enemy radar and to rise at the last moment to dive straight down. The act of crashing was not seen as failure, but as an absolute spiritual triumph. Dying was not a risk, it was the goal. The kamikaze attacks were not improvised. Each pilot received a specific target: aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers. The plane was loaded with 250-kilogram bombs and fuel only for a one-way trip. Before takeoff, the pilot wrote his final message: "I beg you not to weep for me. Tomorrow I will fly to the eternal realm." The mechanics stood at attention in silence. There were no emotional speeches or embraces. The departure was solemn, ritualistic, irreversible. Upon reaching the combat zone, the kamikazes dove steeply, flying through anti-aircraft fire. Many were shot down before impact, but those who succeeded in completing their mission turned a plane into a weapon more destructive than any torpedo. Their comrades at the base listened to the radio reports. "The commander has achieved his objective. He has crashed gloriously." Instead of silence, shouts of jubilation were heard. In the first months, kamikaze attacks sank more than 30 Allied ships and severely damaged over 300 others. American sailors began to live each dawn with the fear of planes that did not seek to survive. The kamikaze concept extended beyond the air. Suicide boats called Shinyo were built, designed to crash into ships with explosive charges. Midget submarines called Kaiten were created, operated by a single man who was to ram into the enemy hull. Even suicide divers, the Fukuryu, were trained, equipped with explosives meant to detonate beneath invading ships during the anticipated invasion of Japan. Sacrifice became national doctrine. The media spread images of Japanese mothers solemnly giving their sons to the army, declaring that their deaths would be the family's pride. In elementary schools, children practiced the farewell rite, a bow, a song to the emperor, a vow to give their lives for the homeland. Death ceased to be a biological event and became a collective aspiration. As the war went on and defeats mounted, the strategy of sacrifice became the only official policy. There was no plan B. In Tokyo, there was open discussion about the total mobilization of the population for a final battle within the archipelago. Every man, woman, and child was to be ready to die. The General Staff calculated that more than 20 million Japanese would sacrifice themselves to stop the American invasion. It was not a rhetorical figure, it was a detailed plan, approved and transmitted to local authorities. Internal repression, censorship, total control, and indoctrination. Starting in the 1930s, Japan gradually transformed into a totalitarian state in which all spheres of public and private life were subordinated to the military machinery and the figure of the emperor. This process did not occur through a single coup d'etat, but through a series of legal, administrative, and cultural reforms whose goal was to dismantle parliamentary democracy, eliminate dissent, and shape the minds of the population for total war. The starting point was the Peace Preservation Law of 1925, enacted to suppress any idea that threatened the kokutai, that is, the national essence based on the emperor's sovereignty. This law was expanded in 1928 and strengthened after 1936 to outlaw any form of thought considered unpatriotic. The concept of crime was not based on concrete actions, but on ideas. The mere expression of doubt about the imperial path could be punished with imprisonment or re-education. Under this legal framework, systematic ideological control was established. The military came to occupy the center of the Japanese state. The army and navy had the right to veto any cabinet that did not include ministers from their own ranks. As nationalist officers gained influence, political parties were reduced to symbolic instruments. In 1940, all remaining parties were dissolved and replaced by the Association for Service to the National Spirit, a single organization created to eliminate any form of political plurality. In this way, the civilian government ceased to exist as an independent entity, and Japan became a military autocracy under the nominal authority of the emperor. The kokutai became the official doctrine of the state. According to this concept, Japan was not a nation in the Western sense, but a sacred organism whose head was the emperor. Citizens were not individuals with rights, but subjects with eternal obligations. The state did not exist to protect the people. The people existed to serve the imperial state. This ideology was spread through state Shinto, a version of traditional Japanese religion manipulated to legitimize the emperor's absolute rule. Temples and priests were placed under government supervision, assigned patriotic functions, and forbidden to offer any spiritual interpretation that did not recognize the emperor's divinity. Censorship was total. The Ministry of the Interior and, from 1941 onward, the Ministry of Information controlled newspapers, radio, literature, theatre and film. Every publication had to exalt sacrifice, discipline and Japan's imperial destiny. Reports of military defeats were prohibited. Only victories and proclamations of heroic resistance were broadcast. Newspapers became organs of propaganda. Imperial radio aired daily official messages, patriotic hymns and speeches calling for the destruction of the foreign enemy. Culture was reformulated to serve the war effort, replacing artistic creativity with uniform and exalted propaganda. Education was militarized from the most basic levels. In 1937, the rescript of the new educational system was enacted, requiring all schools to teach absolute loyalty to the emperor and obedience to the state. Textbooks were rewritten to present Japanese history as a continuous narrative of divine destiny. Critical thinking was eliminated, and the idea that death in battle was the highest form of existence was promoted. In 1941, education was completely reorganized to prepare youth for military mobilization. Classes included martial instruction, combat drills, and national defense exercises. Older students were directly incorporated into factories or military training units. Social control became omnipresent. Neighborhood associations known as tonari-gumi were organized to monitor residents' behavior, promote nationalist activities, and denounce attitudes deemed unpatriotic. These organizations reported directly to the Kempeitai, the military police, and the Toko, the special thought police. Meetings were mandatory and served to spread official propaganda and ensure that every household actively participated in the war effort. There was no room for neutrality. Passivity was considered opposition. The Kempeitai became the main instrument of repression. Although formally a military police force, in practice it exercised control over civilians and had the authority to arrest, interrogate and punish without judicial intervention. It used methods of psychological shock, isolation and violence to suppress any form of dissent. It was not necessary to commit a concrete act. Thinking incorrectly was enough to be arrested. Surveillance intensified after 1943, when the government feared that the exhaustion of war might weaken public morale. National mobilization was formalized with the 1938 National General Mobilization Law, which authorized the state to control the economy, labor and human resources. This law allowed civilians to be recruited to work in military factories, build fortifications and participate in national defense. The state took control of wages, food, transportation and production. The central idea was to transform the entire population into part of the army. Economic and social life ceased to be oriented toward individual survival and became completely subordinated to imperial victory. Propaganda promoted the notion of the single national body. According to this idea, Japan was an organism in which each person was a cell without an identity separate from the whole. Individual interest had no value. Total obedience was a natural duty. Families were instructed to accept the death of their children as glory, not loss. Women were mobilized to work in armament factories and trained to use improvised weapons in the event of an invasion. The civilian population became a potential combat force. By 1944, this totalitarian structure had been fully consolidated. Independent thought was suppressed. Culture had become a means of war, education, a process of military training, religion, an ideological justification for sacrifice. The economy, an instrument to feed the war machine, and the population, the spiritual raw material to resist until extermination. As American bombs began to fall on Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the Japanese state intensified its message. Defeat was impossible. Death was preferable to surrender. Japan had become a nation prepared not to survive, but to destroy itself with honor. The final collapse, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion. On March 9, 1945, at 10:30 p.m., the deadliest air raid in modern history began over Tokyo. 329 B-29 aircraft of the U.S. Bombing Command crossed the night sky, loaded with incendiary bombs composed of napalm and white phosphorus. Instead of targeting factories or military bases, they were deliberately aimed at densely populated neighborhoods built of wood and paper. Within hours, the fire spread with winds exceeding 50 kilometers per hour, generating a thermal inferno that reached temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius. Victims did not die from impact, but from asphyxiation and burning. In a single night, more than 100,000 civilians lost their lives, and 1 million were left homeless. Tokyo was reduced to a sea of ashes. This attack, part of Operation Meeting House, was the prelude to systematic destruction that would be repeated in more than 60 Japanese cities in the following months. The incendiary bombings were not aimed at conquering territories or destroying armies. They were designed to break the urban structure and the morale of the population. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of industrial centers were attacked in a similar manner. Estimates from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey calculate that between March and July 1945, more than 500,000 Japanese civilians died during this campaign. The imperial government, however, continued to demand absolute resistance. Authorities declared that the dead became spiritual guardians of the empire. The use of the word defeat was not permitted in the press. Schools continued instructing children on how to face an American invasion with bamboo spears. While Japanese skies burned, the Continental Front collapsed just as rapidly. In Manchuria, the Kwantung Army, considered for years the empire's most prestigious force, had been weakened by the diversion of troops to the Pacific. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched Operation August Storm. More than 1.5 million soldiers of the Red Army advanced against Japanese positions in Manchuria, Korea, and northern China. In barely a week, the Japanese army was crushed. The defenses collapsed with no possibility of reorganization. Japanese units were surrounded and annihilated with mechanized warfare tactics that surpassed any capacity for response. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were captured. Lines of communication were destroyed. For Imperial Japan, the Soviet invasion demonstrated that the war could no longer be contained within the islands. It had spilled over on all fronts. 3 days before the Soviet attack on August 6, 1945 at 8:15 a.m., the American bomber Enola Gay dropped on Hiroshima a device known as Little Boy, the first atomic bomb used against a civilian population. It detonated about 600 meters above the city center with a power equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at the epicenter reached approximately 4,000 degrees Celsius. In an instant, more than 70,000 people died. Buildings, bridges, and temples were vaporized. A mushroom-shaped cloud rose more than 12 kilometers high. Of the city's 76,000 buildings, 70% were destroyed. Many survivors died in the following days from burns, radiation sickness, and lack of medical care. Communications were interrupted. The Japanese government issued no clear information about the attack, describing it as a new type of bomb without admitting its true nature. On August 7th, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War met in Tokyo. Some members insisted that the nation must continue fighting, arguing that a single attack did not determine the outcome of the war. The doctrine of sacrifice remained in force. The emperor did not intervene. While the political elite debated, Hiroshima burned under a black rain of radiation and ashes. On August 9th, the Soviet Union began the invasion of Sakhalin Island and the offensive on Korea. That same day, at 11:02 a.m., the B-29 bomber Boxcar dropped the bomb Fat Man on Nagasaki. The explosion had a power equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The mountainous terrain reduced the radius of destruction, but the devastation was immediate. Between 40,000 and 75,000 people died instantly. Shockwaves destroyed factories, schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods. The city of Nagasaki, one of the empire's industrial centers, was reduced to ruins. Unlike Hiroshima, where most victims were civilians, in Nagasaki the casualties included a large number of industrial workers and Allied prisoners of war. By August 10th, the Japanese government was paralyzed. Imperial radio could no longer conceal the magnitude of the attacks. The Ministry of the Interior reported that after the incendiary and atomic bombings, more than 25% of the country's urban housing had been destroyed. Industrial production was below 30% of its 1941 capacity. The logistical collapse was total. There was no fuel, no transport, no supply lines. Food reserves were exhausted. Millions of civilians were displaced. The armed forces lacked ammunition and aircraft. Despite everything, sectors of the High Command insisted on continuing the war under a strategy of attrition. hoping to inflict enough casualties on the United States to negotiate more favorable conditions. They argued that an American land invasion of Japan would cause millions of deaths among the attackers and thus justify continuing the conflict. They proposed mobilizing the entire population for the final defense of the archipelago. This position still had support within the Army General Staff. On August 12th, Emperor Hirohito was personally informed of the military situation. He received concrete reports. The Red Army was at the gates of Manchuria and Korea. The atomic bombs had destroyed entire cities. The Imperial Navy was incapable of confronting the US fleet. The national economy was in terminal collapse. Ciphered communications intercepted by the United States indicated that Japan was attempting to seek Soviet mediation to negotiate a conditional peace. The Soviet invasion demonstrated that this strategy had failed. On August 13th, American aircraft dropped leaflets over Tokyo, warning that if Japan did not surrender, new atomic bombs would be used. The High Command had no proof of how many more bombs the United States possessed. Uncertainty increased the fear of total national destruction. However, the defenders of war insisted that surrender would mean the spiritual annihilation of the empire. On the night of August 14th, the last meeting of the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, also known as the Big Six, was held. Up to that moment, 4 of the 6 members voted to continue the war. Emperor Hirohito intervened personally, declaring that the suffering of the people could not be prolonged. He did not speak of defeat or guilt. He ordered the acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. That same night, while the radio announcement was being prepared, a group of army officers attempted a coup d'état to prevent the surrender. They seized the imperial palace, blocked access points, and sought to destroy the recording of the speech. They believed the war had to continue until the death of the last Japanese. They were unable to find the recording, which had been hidden. The coup failed at dawn. The faction that desired national self-immolation was neutralized without major clashes. The empire was on the brink of total dissolution. Tokyo, ravaged by flames, waited in silence for the announcement that would end the madness. The cities had no electricity. The starving population looked to the skies in fear of a third nuclear attack. Hiroshima and Nagasaki still burned among radioactive ruins. In Manchuria, the remnants of the Kwantung Army surrendered to the Soviet advance. On August 15, 1945, Japan still officially existed as an empire, but its territory was destroyed, its army annihilated, its population on the verge of collapse, and its imperial myth shattered by the absolute force of fire. The Tokyo Trials and the Silence of the Emperor. At noon on August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese gathered around radios in ruined cities and rural villages. For the first time in history, they would hear the voice of their emperor. The broadcast began with a confusing message, delivered in archaic Japanese that most of the population could not fully understand. Hirohito did not utter the word surrender. He declared that the war had not developed in Japan's favor, that a cruel enemy had used a bomb of incalculable power, and that continuing to fight would lead to the total annihilation of the people. He asked his subjects to endure the unendurable. With those words, the empire that had proclaimed itself eternal acknowledged its defeat. The reaction was silent. There were no public celebrations or outbursts of joy. Japan had not been conquered in the terms of traditional warfare. It had been broken by the weight of absolute destruction. The cities were burning. The economy had vanished. More than 2 million soldiers were dead or missing, and millions of civilians had lost their homes. Peace was not celebrated. It was the recognition of final collapse. On August 28th, U.S. occupation forces began to arrive. General Douglas MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo without encountering resistance. He bore the responsibility of dismantling Japan's imperial apparatus and ensuring that the country would never again become a military threat. The occupation was total. The armed forces were dissolved. Weapons factories were shut down. Military laws were abolished. The Japanese state ceased to exist as a sovereign power. For the first time in its history, Japan was administered by a foreign force. On September 11th, MacArthur issued General Order No. 1, instructing all Japanese commanders to formally surrender. Thousands of officers handed over their swords. Divisions still stationed in China and the Pacific laid down their arms. The Imperial Navy was dismantled. Military bases were occupied. The social control system based on the Tonarigumi neighborhood associations was dissolved. The Allied occupation initiated an unprecedented process to try the leaders of a defeated nation not only for traditional war crimes, but for crimes against humanity and for planning a war of aggression. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, known as the Tokyo Trials, was officially established on January 19, 1946. It was composed of judges from 11 Allied countries, including the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, Australia, India, and others. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted captured Nazi leaders, the Tokyo trials faced a crucial political decision: whether Emperor Hirohito would be treated as a responsible leader or as an untouchable symbol. The United States decided not to prosecute the emperor. MacArthur believed that keeping Hirohito on the throne would facilitate the stability of the occupation and prevent a potential nationalist uprising. An official narrative was constructed portraying the emperor as a ceremonial figure manipulated by radical militarists. All documents and testimonies directly implicating Hirohito in war decisions were classified or discarded. The tribunal did not request his testimony. 28 high-ranking civilian and military officials were charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Among them were General Hideki Tojo, former Prime Minister, General Seishiro Itagaki, Marshal Shunroku Hata, diplomat and former Prime Minister Koki Hirota, and General Kenji Doihara, responsible for the invasion of Manchuria through espionage and covert provocations. Political and financial leaders of the empire were also tried. The main charge asserted that Japan had initiated a war of aggression calculated to dominate Asia through the systematic extermination of peoples and nations. The tribunal examined evidence related to massacres such as Nanjing, where photographs, films, and imperial records showed the magnitude of the crimes. It documented the atrocities committed by Unit 731, including vivisections, bacteriological warfare, and human experimentation. Evidence was presented of the Bataan Death March, the brutal treatment of Allied prisoners of war, and the use of Korean, Chinese, and Filipino women as sexual slaves in so-called military comfort stations. Official documents revealed that these practices were not isolated acts, but deliberate state policies. Tojo assumed much of the responsibility. During his testimony, he declared that the emperor had no direct control over government decisions and that he acted on his own initiative. These statements were accepted by the tribunal as sufficient evidence to absolve the emperor of all guilt. However, internal records from the general staff proved that Hirohito had participated in key meetings where the invasions of China and the war against the United States were decided, as well as the use of bacteriological weapons. These records were not admitted as evidence. The trial lasted more than 2 years. In November 1948, sentences were handed down. 7 defendants were condemned to death by hanging, including Hideki Tojo and Itagaki. 16 received life imprisonment. Others were given lesser sentences. The tribunal did not prosecute all those responsible. Many mid-ranking officers, bureaucrats, and scientists involved in medical crimes were never tried. One of the most secret chapters of the trials was the fate of the members of Unit 731. The United States decided to grant immunity to Shiro Ishii and his collaborators in exchange for their research on biological warfare. The data obtained from lethal experiments on human beings were transferred to the US Bacteriological Weapons Program. None of the doctors from Unit 731 were convicted in Tokyo. Most returned to civilian life and occupied positions in universities, hospitals, and ministries during post-war Japan. Emperor Hirohito remained on the throne. In 1946, he was compelled to issue the Humanity Declaration, in which he symbolically renounced his divine status. He affirmed that his authority did not derive from a celestial lineage, but from the consent of the people. This declaration was presented as the end of the imperial myth of divinity. Yet Hirohito did not acknowledge personal responsibility for the war. His figure was preserved as a symbol of national continuity, while a new constitution was drafted under US supervision, establishing Japan's perpetual renunciation of war as a means of sovereignty. Between 1946 and 1951, Japan was rebuilt under an imposed democratic system. Free elections were promoted, freedom of the press was guaranteed, and militarist organizations were dissolved. The economy was restructured to become an industrial power oriented toward civilian production. However, the memory of the war was deliberately shaped. The idea was constructed that the Japanese people had been victims of a fanatical military elite. Individual responsibility was replaced by a narrative of collective suffering. The Tokyo trials marked the official end of the imperial era. They did not judge the institution of the emperor but his servants, nor did they condemn the ideology of Kokutai, only its militarist application. The executions took place in December 1948. Before dying, Hideki Tojo declared that he accepted his sentence so that the emperor could live. His words closed the ideological circle of the imperial state. Even in death, loyalty to the emperor remained intact. For the Japanese people, the silence of the emperor became the symbol of a change of era. Hirohito continued to reign for decades, witnessing the nation's economic rebirth under American protection. He never spoke publicly about the war again. There was no official acknowledgement of guilt from the central figure of the state. Japan had passed from absolute fanaticism to total surrender without an internal revolution. The nation that had indoctrinated millions to die for the emperor now accepted living under his silence.